Member for Macquarie.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And I thank the member for Deakin for raising this matter of public importance. It is something that on this side, and it's a pity that he's walking out of the chamber, as always, and not bothering to listen to things here. If he did more listening and less interjecting, he might actually understand the work that we're doing. We care deeply about the impacts on people of rising mortgages and power bills, in fact, all the increased costs of living. We are so mindful of, and unlike the opposition, we're doing something to address these issues. And sadly, I listened to the member for Deakin. His rhetoric was as empty as the policies he put forward when he was in as housing minister, where the best we got was money for wealthy people to do renovations. And it might not have been him, but his government was certainly keen to say that if you needed to buy a home, you should get a better job or just be born into the right family. Exactly. There are issues that we've inherited. Now, the difference is we accept that. We knew coming into government that we were going to have to clean up a mess. And look, there are probably a few people in this chamber who know I enjoy gardening. That's not to say I do very much of it these days. But when I think about what is involved in creating and nurturing a beautiful garden, I see parallels with the work you have to do to nurture our economy so that people and businesses thrive. I also see parallels in what happens if you neglect it. The impact doesn't happen immediately. Your garden still grows for a while, the flowers still bloom, but there are signs of distress, and you do well to pay attention to those. But at some point, if you ignore those, without the work that's needed in that garden, you find yourself looking at a mess. Overgrown grass, weeds as tall as your rose bushes and fruit trees in dire need of TLC. So how does that help describe where we find ourselves today on this side of the parliament? Well, for a start, as much as those opposite would like to pretend that the challenges we face have only occurred in the last 10 months, the facts just don't back that up. In 2019, well before COVID, and in my community before bushfires and floods, the cost of living was biting. One of the reasons was wage stagnation. Wages simply had not moved. And as we found out, that's because those opposite didn't want wages to go up. In March 2019, then Federal Finance Minister Matthias Cormann said low wage growth was a, quote, deliberate design feature of our economic architecture. So there was deliberate neglect that was taking place. They were early signs and completely ignored by those opposite. They ignored the pleas of workers who said, hey, things are tough. They ignored the issues we raised when we said things were biting for people. And then, of course, neglect led to even worse situation, with inflation biting. And that is obviously the defining challenge of 2023. But let's remember the largest jump in inflation. We just heard the member for Deakin quoting a bunch of inflation figures. The largest jump in inflation in any quarter this century occurred in the March quarter of not 2023, but March 2022, and it was a 2.1% leap. By the way, that was before we took office. That was the worst period for inflation, and interest rates started to rise following that. So you can see the signs of distress were there. They weren't hiding in the soil. They'd broken out in plain sight. Now, when your garden gets into a state, there's a few things you need to do. You need to get some quick control, and weeding is one thing that will absolutely make a difference. But you can't stop there because it's not addressing the real issues. You need to mulch so that the weeds don't come back as fast as you've pulled them out, and then you need to nurture that garden. You won't see the results immediately, but anyone, and I know the National Party will understand that nurturing is really important. It takes time, whether it's roses or wheat that you're growing. Without that, it's never going to thrive. And that's the same sort of thinking we have applied to all the issues we've been left with, whether it's power bills, whether it's inflation, whether it's housing. We don't hide from it. We are proud that we're willing to do that work, to get out there and do the work. So let's start with energy, which was one of the issues. I'm not sure he actually referred to it in his MPI ramblings, is a good way to describe it. But let's talk about power bills. You know, Jennifer Westacott, a highly respected businesswoman, said, "We've not done the work that we should have done for the last decade. We've really made a mess of energy policy." And the chairman of Newcrest, Peter Thompson, says if you don't have a policy for long enough, which has been our situation, you wind up with a situation where intervention's required. This need not have happened had the right energy policy been put in place. What we're seeing is a symptom. And indeed, 22 policies and they didn't land one of them. They left Australia with a national energy grid built for the last century. So we are doing the work. We know there's long-term work to do, but we also know that people needed help quickly. And that's why we did work so closely with the states and territories on getting cost of living support that would not drive greater inflation. Really well thought through in collaboration with the states. And we know that our aim is that those deals with the states, working individually with each state, we are really looking forward to being able to see those flow through to people in coming weeks and months. But it does take time to do that work. However, the really big work, by the way, I feel like we've said it a lot here, but we know that Russia's invasion of Ukraine saw energy costs skyrocket, and we understand how challenging that is for small businesses, big businesses. The key decisions we made last year, remember when we brought the parliament back? Remember when those opposite voted against any price relief for people? But what we know is that what we've done has made a difference. AGL, in a statement to the Australian Stock Exchange just last month, said notably the impact of government intervention has contributed to a sharp decline in forward electricity prices. So we know what we're doing is working. And Dr Stephen Kennedy from Treasury described it as a package that will make a material difference to reducing cost of living pressures. So in energy, we've bit the bullet and we're doing the longer-term work, getting clean energy, which is the cheapest form of energy you can have. And the passage of our safeguards mechanism means that we will start to see significant and serious change. Our incentives to get people to move across to electric vehicles, all those things will make a difference. Now, we talked, those opposite talk about interest rates. Again, how challenging it is for people who have mortgages to cope with the additional costs they're facing, and that is driven by inflation. So what are we doing to tackle inflation, which we know those opposite recognise, because in September 22, May 22 and April 22, the member for Hume, the opposition leader, the former Prime Minister, all talked about the pressures of rising costs of living coming from not just the war in Ukraine, but the disruptions to supply chains. And, of course, we're tackling that supply chain issue with the National Reconstruction Fund, which this parliament passed, no thanks to those opposite. So every measure we've put in place has been opposed by those opposite. In the time that I've got, I think it really is important to touch on the things we've done where we know people's mortgages have gone up. We also recognise there are things that we can do quite quickly, just like weeding the garden. We can make some quick changes to ease the cost of living pressures on people. And what are those things? Well, cheaper medicines is one of those things. And as we've heard today, we've had the biggest cut in the cost of medicines to people in the entire public PBS scheme. That has made millions and millions of dollars difference to people around the country by saving them that money. We've also got cheaper childcare, less than 100 days, families with children in childcare, and that is one of those areas we can make a difference. And guess what? So we have. Unlike those opposite who saw the danger signs, they chose to ignore those danger signs at every single step of the way. And now all they do when we put up the solutions is they say no. They've said no to the energy price relief plan we had. They're saying no to the Housing Australia Future Fund. Guess what? More supply takes pressure off housing prices, which helps people have lower mortgages. So they should be ashamed of themselves for coming in here pretending to care and doing nothing.
Member for Riverina.
You know what else will oppose? Member for Macquarie.